Okay, so Allison, the woman who spends maybe half her waking hours trying to keep me on task, which is not an easy mission, let me tell you. She had an idea for us honey badgers to do a series of 3 videos each, beginning with one that details why we are not feminists. Given that Allison's talent for nagging in terms of both stamina and creativity rivals my mother's, I have enthusiastically and completely voluntarily consented to explain to everyone of you all why I am not a feminist. But first things first. What do I mean when I use the word feminism? How do I define this term? And I really have to define it because of the murky nature of the word as it's used in broader society. If the dictionary definition of feminism, yada yada equality, yada yada, was all there was to it, I would likely consider myself a feminist, or at least pro-feminist, but that really isn't all there is to it. To properly assess feminism, what it is and what it does, we first are stuck dealing with the sticky business of patriarchy and all that it implies. And no, patriarchy theory is not an invention of the second wave. You can see the worldview of patriarchy theory expressed very plainly in the very first officially recognized collective feminist document, published the same year as the Communist Manifesto, the Declaration of Sentiments. In part, it stated, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her." Now that sounds like patriarchy. The Declaration then presents a laundry list of social, political, and legal norms to support this supposition, and absolutely none that might possibly call it into question. So let's think about that for a minute here. The history of mankind is essentially one long human rights violation against women. This has been the sentiment of feminism since its very beginnings, and it colors all of feminism's subsequent efforts. So no, if it is about equality, it's not only about equality. It's not just about a goal or a stated purpose, it's also about a diagnosis. Now, an analogy I have often used in the past when talking about feminism is the four humors theory of disease. I would suggest that the medical establishment at that time truly believed it was in the business of treating and curing disease. They truly believed that they were doing something beneficial. But because the diagnosis of the problem was so fundamentally incorrect, any prescribed treatments and cures often did more harm than good. So, attached to what I am calling feminism, we have a whole host of assumptions, observations, perspectives, and hypotheses that can be described collectively as the feminist lens. And foundational to these is the model of patriarchy that was born in the 1850s and fleshed out through the ensuing waves of feminism. And along with that comes its accompanying systemic conditions of male privilege and female oppression. Now, these three things, patriarchy and its associated conditions of male privilege and female oppression, this is the lifeblood of all the branches and sects of feminism that have any influence at all in society, from pop feminists like Lacey Green to political feminists like Gloria Steinem. So when I talk about feminism, I'm talking about an ideology and its associated movement that is based in whole or in part on the following propositions. 1. That society currently and historically is patriarchal. 2. That patriarchy is a social system wherein men hold the majority of the economic, social, and political power, and women are largely excluded from it, resulting in 3. Systemic male privilege and the systemic oppression of women. Now, from these assumptions, we can extrapolate a few inevitable secondary beliefs that, in my experience, are consistently supported by most feminists themselves in their arguments and advocacy, even if they're rarely very plain spoken about it. And the first is that this is all men's fault. From the basic feminist definition of patriarchy, we can conclude that these patriarchies are constructed and maintained primarily, if not entirely, by men. We know this because patriarchies are defined as systems where men hold the majority of economic, social, and political power, and women are largely excluded from it. You don't hold an enslaved people responsible for slavery, even if some slaves contribute through their beliefs and actions to the perpetuation of the oppressive system. You hold the people who have the social, economic, and political power necessary to construct and maintain the system, and who benefit from the system. Being the group that holds the majority of power, it is and always has been entirely within men's collective capability to construct the system as they wish and maintain it regardless of the wishes of others. Women who help perpetuate the system are, in essence, still victims. They are either brainwashed into helping to maintain a system that oppresses them, which would be called internalized misogyny, or they're forced into finding ways of making patriarchy work for them at the expense of other women. But these women are incidental rather than instrumental to the inherent social structure of patriarchy. Like the house nigger, they may make it easier for patriarchy to oppress women, but they do not cause the oppression, did not choose to be oppressed, and have no power to end the oppression. Which leads us to the next inevitable secondary belief. Men are bad. If one believes in patriarchy, as feminists describe it, we must believe the system exists the way it does because men collectively prefer it that way. They, being the group with the most power, are the only ones in a position to change the system, and despite 150 years of feminism, we are, feminists tell us, still living in a patriarchy where men hold most of the power and where men are privileged and women are oppressed. One could even argue that it is only the existence of feminism over the last century and a half that holds men culpable for this, that actually solidifies the indictment against them as bad actors. After all, prior to feminism, men had the defense of ignorance. Maybe they simply didn't realize they were oppressing women. But for more than a century, activist feminists have been informing men about these oppressions and harms. And yet, according to these same feminists, we are still living in a patriarchy that privileges men and oppresses women. And some feminists, like Gloria Steinem, even contend that women today are more oppressed than ever. Now, feminists have in recent years made some concessions in terms of the negative aspects of gender roles on men, often presented either sincerely or sneeringly as patriarchy hurts men too. Some of them have even conceded that some of these norms cause more harm to men than to women. Men's higher suicide rates, for instance, or their greater risk of death on the job. It's important to note, however, that the general attitude of feminists toward these harms is that they are, at their core, a byproduct of male privilege and the fault of men themselves. Men collectively hold the majority of power in society, therefore only men have the power to change these norms, which, when you think about it, is actually more rather than less damning of men, as I'll come to in a moment. So this is why the typical response of feminists to any assertion that men are, for instance, more likely than women to be victimized by violence, no matter why such an assertion has been made, their response is typically to note, and who are victimizing them? Other men. While this is often true, it's also often beside the point. In my own experience, such data is usually presented as a rebuttal to feminist arguments regarding the alleged normalization of and pervasive social endorsement of violence against women, and suggestions that violence against women occurs because women are singled out as socially acceptable targets for said violence. It should become much more difficult to argue that women are oppressed by the system because of their gender, when they are the least likely demographic in society to suffer violence. And it should further become impossible to argue this in the face of government-sponsored initiatives from the local to the global level aimed at specifically eliminating violence against women, even though women are less likely to be victimized. But such nuances are lost on most feminists. The go-to response seems to be to create an equivalence between perpetrator and victim. Most violence against men is perpetrated by other men, therefore it's men's own fault that men are more likely to suffer violence. And while some more thoughtful feminists will acknowledge that male-male violence is often encouraged by the system and not considered a pressing concern by society, that is, that both the violence and society's acceptance of it is systemic, we are then left with the very sticky secondary belief that is never spoken, but is the inevitable outcome, the inevitable conclusion of feminism's patriarchy hypothesis. Men are so awful, they will willingly and willfully and knowingly perpetuate a system that causes them harm, often in egregious and horrific ways, so that they can maintain their collective systemic power to oppress women. Men continue to maintain the system, despite having been informed of how the system harms women, and despite having been informed of how the system harms men. They have the collective power to change the system and stop all of this harm, yet they haven't. They can, but they won't. In essence, men hate women so much that they will knowingly hurt themselves and each other if in doing so, women will continue to be dominated, controlled, and exploited. Now, I make no claim that these secondary beliefs are any part of the conscious thought processes and feelings of most feminists. Generally, it's only been the most radical who've been willing to consciously travel down this ugly branch of feminist logic. They are the feminists who've advocated male genocide, like Sally Miller Gerhardt and Mary Daly, the ones who, like Brown, Miller, and McKinnon, have described rape as part of a concerted male campaign to keep women subjugated and terrorized, and who describe women's oppression by men as the wellspring and the blueprint for all other forms of human exploitation and conflict. Most modern feminists will tell you they don't hate men. They don't blame men for the system. They don't see men as the enemy. Yet, they believe in the very propositions that would justify, or arguably necessitate, the characterization of men as an enemy worthy of hate. Now, at this point, I want to make a few things clear. A lot of women, celebrities and ordinary women on the street, have commented that they don't identify as feminists because they don't hate men, or they don't agree with the actions of feminists, or because they object to the effect feminism has had on society, or on families, or on the economy. Some choose not to be feminist because they believe it's harmful or hateful. And these are all valid reasons to choose not to be a feminist, but they're not the reason that I'm not a feminist. I did a video ages ago about the encroachment of feminism within the atheist community, and in it I described my personal feelings about my atheism. I want to make it clear here that I'm not anti-theist whatsoever, and I am not in this video opening any kind of discussion as to the merits of faith or its lack. I'm simply using my position on theism and atheism as an analogy for my position on feminism. In that video, I said that my position was evidence-based. It was empirical in nature. I come from a non-religious secular family. Both of my parents believe in God, but neither of them have ever made any kind of big, hairy deal about it. I spent my childhood around other kids, some of whom went to church regularly, and around adults of varying degrees of faith and religiosity. I grew up knowing that some people believe in God, including my parents and most of my extended family, but without anyone telling me that I should or must also believe in God. To the extent that religion was part of my education, it was learning about God and religion rather than being taught to believe in God or a particular religion. So to me, atheism was never a question of tearing myself free of a deeply held faith, because I never had any faith to begin with. My atheism was never a question of someone having to prove to me that God doesn't exist. It's always been a question of waiting for someone to demonstrate to me that God does exist. And as much as some religious narratives can really tug at my heartstrings, including those surrounding the Christ, his teachings, his sacrifice on humanity's behalf, and his resurrection, the fact that a story is compelling, or that it embodies a larger truth, or a noble message, or a desirable set of moral values, well, none of that actually makes it reality. That Christ is a powerful symbol and has inspired many good things and brought comfort and solace to many people doesn't make his story real. Now, if someone convinced me that belief in God was beneficial to humanity as a whole, it wouldn't matter. I would still be an atheist. If someone convinced me that secular values were extremely detrimental to society, I'd still be an atheist. Likewise, common arguments that religion and faith are more bad for society than good, or have resulted in genocides or other atrocities, have absolutely nothing to do with my lack of belief in God. Pascal's wager? That just isn't a good enough reason for me to believe in something that, in my opinion, has not been sufficiently demonstrated to be true. I don't believe in God because the case for God's existence hasn't yet been demonstrated to my satisfaction. Whether belief in God is good or bad for individuals or humanity is not an argument as to God's existence or lack thereof. And at best, to this point, the most I have ever seen from any theist are compelling arguments around the idea that God could exist. And this is something I've never disputed. Lots of things could exist, but I am not going to accept that they do until I see evidence that they do. Likewise, if feminism's impact on society was 100% beneficial to every person on this planet, I would not consider myself a feminist, because I don't believe its foundational assumptions regarding patriarchy, male privilege, and female oppression. If feminism's impact on society was 100% harmful, and being a feminist required gender warfare against men, but I did believe in its foundational premises, if I did believe those to be accurate and well demonstrated and fully reflective of reality, I would be a feminist. If I believed in patriarchy, male privilege, and female oppression, I would absolutely see men as the enemy, and I would do whatever was in my power, whatever I could, to defeat that enemy. But the truth is, I don't believe those foundational premises. The case has not been proven to my satisfaction. For feminists to convince me that their foundational premises are true, those premises would need to be subjected to sincere, rigorous, unsuccessful attempts at falsification, to definitive disconfirmation of the null hypothesis, and disconfirmation of any and all alternative hypotheses that could explain the universality of gender roles and the pervasiveness of patrilineal family structures and gendered distribution of authority and division of labor in all known societies that have achieved the status of civilizations. And like I've said, some of the best arguments against these presuppositions come from feminists themselves, and often in the most hilarious ways, because they're often presented by those feminists as gotcha moments, when in reality the person who got is the feminist. One good example of this was during the question and answer session in Norwich after the screening of the Red Pill movie. About 40 minutes in, Mike Buchanan makes the point that while yes, men are the majority in Parliament and the majority among the people who pass laws, the bedrock assumption of feminism is that these men are making decisions and passing laws that advantage men and disadvantage women. He argued that this is not the case, and used the example of the criminal justice system, wherein men are more harshly treated. Under identical circumstances, the law is uniformly more harshly applied against men than against women, to the effect that if male defendants were treated as leniently as female ones, 5 of 6 men currently imprisoned in the UK would not be there. The response from one of the feminists on the panel was to ask, and I'm paraphrasing, "Well, sure, but how many of the judges deciding these cases are women? Not very many. It's men who are doing this, not women." Yes, my dear, we know. That was actually the whole point. The feminist model of patriarchy, male privilege, and female oppression rests on the idea that men hold the majority of power and authority in society, and that they use this power to privilege men as a class at the expense of women's oppression. It's not about the genitals of the people who wield power. It's about on whose behalf and for whose benefit that power is wielded. If men in power are more likely to wield that power on behalf of and to the benefit of women than men as a group, then your feminist model of patriarchy is woefully inadequate. But congratulations, you just proved Mike Buchanan's point and undermined your entire belief system, and you don't even realize it. The reality is that there are other hypotheses that more accurately and consistently explain all of the things feminism attempts to explain, from the disparity of men and women in STEM to the reason why 90% of the market for wrinkle cream is female, without having to perform mental backflips regarding why patriarchy doesn't just hurt men too, but explaining how a system constructed and maintained by men for the benefit of men and at the expense of women's oppression often, and in many areas of life that are the most important to human well-being, hurts men more than it hurts women. And when you think about the religious nature of these feminist beliefs, the explanation for that reality often amounts to patriarchy works in mysterious ways. Feminism isn't interested in falsification of their hypothesis, nor in any alternative hypotheses. When confronted with disconfirming evidence, feminists, like the one at the panel, will actually see and interpret that evidence as confirming evidence. Other more radical feminists will actively suppress the gathering and dissemination of that disconfirming evidence. One example of this is the inimical Daphna Joel of the University of Tel Aviv. She appeared a year or 3 ago on The Agenda with Steve Paikin, I'll link that in the low bar, on a panel discussing sex differences in brain structure and behavior. Now, she has helped conduct 2 separate studies, one on brain structures and the other on stereotypically gendered behaviors and interests. And those studies found that in aggregate, men tend to strongly lean towards male patterns and women strongly lean towards female patterns. She then went on to report to mainstream media that because her research had found very, very few people who had brains that were 100% female or 100% male, or preferences and behaviors that were 100% female or 100% male, that there is no such thing as a male brain or a female brain, and no such thing as male or female preferences. So, in other words, despite the findings of her studies that there were very strong sex differences between men and women, she presented these results as a confirmation that there are no sex differences at all. She then went on to claim that any such differences are the result of culturization, the imposition of society on individuals. When it was put to her that yes, there are very few people who only display male or female typical brain structures or behavioral preferences, that most people still strongly tend toward their biological sex, she said she found that line of questioning uninteresting. She went on to further suggest that any researcher who would want to scientifically determine the extent of the biological contribution to such sex differences could only possibly be doing so in the interest of justifying discrimination. In other words, there are no innate differences, but if there are, anyone who attempts to quantify them is a sexist bigot whose ultimate goal is to justify the oppression of women. I'm not a feminist because I don't believe their hypothesis of patriarchy as a system that privileges men at the expense of women. I don't believe their hypothesis because not only have they never attempted to falsify it themselves, but they actively seek to discredit, discourage, and demonize those who do want to attempt to falsify it, or to present alternative hypotheses to explain gender differences and our perceptions of gender. That's why I'm not a feminist. I don't believe feminism's core assumptions. Not only have they not demonstrated to me why I should believe their patriarchy narrative, they have been consistently unable to convincingly address the significant amount of evidence that calls their narrative into question. Now, I'm a big fan of due process and the rule of law and the burden of proof and all of those kinds of things. And I just want you to picture a criminal court where feminism is the prosecutor and patriarchy is the defendant. If all the jury ever saw was the prosecution's opening and closing arguments and evidence given by witnesses for the prosecution, I wouldn't vote to convict, even absent any affirmative defense on the part of patriarchy. If I'm only hearing evidence from one side, I'm not going to convict. Now imagine that the defendant has mounted an affirmative defense. His counsel proves that some of the prosecutor's evidence has been falsified or tampered with, and that most of the most compelling circumstantial evidence could be explained by some other equally reasonable cause. Then it was the patriarchy that done did it. Now you tell me, should I believe in any of this? Anyhow, that's it for me. That's why I'm not a feminist, and my next video will be dealing with the question of why I am an anti-feminist. So, I hope to see you all then. Until then, see you later.